JP Heath from the Church of Sweden, and today it's my great joy and delight to be here with Notando Hadebe.
Yes.
Notando, you've been involved most recently in the work of the supplementary addition to the One Body material, and I wonder if you want to tell us a little bit about how that material was developed and what it's about.
Yes. Firstly, I would like to say thank you, JP, for inviting me. Thank you for this opportunity. I want to appreciate that. What happened is that a series of events happened where suddenly the churches became aware of the violence. It's been going on, the violence against LGBTI, but I think there was an awakening, a desire to be able to respond, to no longer be bystanders when members of the communities are being violated simply because of who they are. So church leaders came and said, we've got to confront this issue.
And sorry, if I ask you, church leaders, you're talking about the Fellowship of the Councils of Churches in Southern Africa.
Yes, absolutely. I'm talking about, that fellowship of the mostly mainline churches. That's your Anglican, Roman Catholic, but they also have now African independent churches as well. And also the Catholic Church is a member. So there was a sense, these are the same churches that responded together to apartheid. So they responded together to HIV and AIDS, and they felt that they cannot be silent in the context of massive violence against LGBTI, that it's a violation of their faith. Yeah.
This initial partnership was what we call Nordic Fokisa, the councils of churches from the Nordic countries, together with the councils of churches of Southern Africa. And as you've said, they got together in the 1990s to address 1980s.
Yes.
To address apartheid.
Yes.
And they moved on from there and started addressing the issues around HIV. The material that you've developed is written by Africans.
Yes.
And I mean, you have some rather impressive names there. Share with us.
Yes. We managed to get Professor Dr. Gunda, who is an Old Testament scholar, whose doctorate is actually on LGBTI and the Hebrew Bible. So you already have a top scholar there. We've got Bishop Malusi, who is the leader of the chair of the council and a very active activist during apartheid. We've got Dr. Fulata, who is, working at the World Council of Churches in the women's desk, and she used to be a lecturer at UKZN. We've got Lebo Hang, who is a PhD student and who is the current coordinator of this of the Fokisa book, and we've got Reverend Noctula, who is a self-identified lesbian pastor. So we've got Africans scholarship that are rooted in the African context, speaking about these issues. And I think for us, this is significant.
Yeah. 3 women.
Yes, 3 women.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, which is really something. The majority of the writers are women.
Yes.
Yes.
And you led the process.
Yes, that's right. I facilitated the church leaders meeting together, so that, and they were meeting to deliberate as well as to engage with LGBTI and to make a decision that we as the Council of Churches are going to move forward. So yeah, I facilitated that meeting.
Just very briefly,
yeah,
the themes that come up in the 5 articles that this material is based on are themes that are cross-cutting in terms of a way of addressing some of the gaps in theology. And as I understand, take us through the 5 things. Take us through the 5 things.
Yes, I agree with what you are saying. The first article by Bishop Malusi is looking at the church as the salt and the light of the world. So there's no option. Salt and light means transformation. So the church is not an organization that sits and observes, but it's an active in the society. And then he brings in his article the methodology, the liberation theology methodology of see, judge, and act, and says that this is the methodology that got us through apartheid. This is the methodology that got us through HIV, and we're certainly going to use that methodology to get us through the church engaging with LGBTI. So immediately he starts by challenging, by bringing the church to its very core and its mission, and saying there's a methodology that we've used, so let's go with it. So already it's all framed within something, experiences that people are familiar with. So that's Bishop Malusi's paper. Gunda. Yes, Dr. Gunda. Dr. Gunda, as an Old Testament scholar, he goes to the very heart, because he now takes the Bible, where most of the texts that people draw from to make opinions about LGBTI come from. And he begins by taking two concepts, one from African culture, which is Ubuntu, that everybody knows about, which is a person through relationships with others. So the relational aspect of your identity is not sexual. Your identity is being humane. So which is a very, very critical issue to bring into this discourse. And then he tackles the Bible, and he makes a point that it is a contested text, that all Christians, that as Christians we use the same text, and yet we differ almost on every subject. We differ on baptism, the how of baptism, the who gets baptized. We differ on role of a woman. We differ on communion, or aspects, and yet we claim to use the same Bible. So he uses that concept to say this is a contested text. And so therefore, when we take the text and look at how churches understand LGBTI, we see two broad-based different perspective. We have the one which uses bullet text. That's what he says, to be able to say this is an identity that is hated and condemned by God. Excuse me. And then on the other side are liberation theologians who look at the big picture based on the identity of the human dignity of persons, the whole prophetic emphasis on justice, the whole teaching on the body of Christ. All of those principles begin to inform this other group to say that LGBTI persons are human, they're made in the image of God, there's a place for sexual diversity, and that diversity is an intrinsic part of God's creation. Everything is diverse. So we've got diverse IQs, we've got diverse heights, diverse hair, diverse everything. So it makes sense to have diverse sexualities. So it's more on those kind of principles that this group comes in, and so it begins to introduce the community to a fact that they already know, that the Bible is contested and that we disagree on everything. But in this matter, to kind of present what are the two broad-based divisions amongst Christians.
And then what about Dr. Fulata Moyo?
Dr. Fulata Moyo comes and disrupts the narrative even more, because now she introduces the whole concept, the whole subject of sexuality. And she talks from her own experience. She was a Christian leader in her university in Malawi, and she became pregnant before marriage. And she highlights how that experience of being marginalized, being insulted, and she was called the temptress because her boyfriend was seen as an innocent victim, and she, as a woman, is the seducer. So she was clearly, because he did nothing, and so she was, really marginalized because of that. And what her story brings out is the whole issue of how difficult it is in churches to deal with issues of sexuality. And how when it comes to sexuality, it's as if our consciousness is heightened in terms of judgmentalism and exclusion. So she brings that story and she juxtaposes it with the story of the Canaanite woman who approaches Jesus, and Jesus works on her prejudice and says, but I didn't come for the Canaanites, I came for the Jews. But she keeps insisting and dialoguing, and that's where Fulata says that's where you wrestle until you get your dignity. And I think that becomes a very critical aspect of this conversation, to say that firstly, sexuality is a big problem in the church. Somehow sexual sins are at the highest level, but those that are marginalized because of that, they have a voice of wrestling their dignity away from those who try to take it away from them. And then that is the story of Fulata. She opens the space for people to tell their stories by telling hers and by being vulnerable in this process. Yeah.
You're exciting us. Lebohang.
Oh, Lebohang does the, because most of the time when it comes to sexuality, the people that talk about sexuality and they're accepted are usually men. To have a woman talking about sexuality with such clarity is something that I think, just it gives this tool something very unique. And Lebohang steps right in there, and she talks about sexuality in the African context, the fact that it's a taboo, it's a secret, and how sex is done in the dark, under covers, when everybody's sleeping, she and the taboo and all the things that everybody would echo, and how even the language it's very difficult to find life-affirming language about sexuality, even about the body parts. There isn't any life-affirming language about that. Usually it's like swear words. And so she talks about that. But what she does is even more important. She says, yes, we've got traditional understandings of sexuality, but we are now living in a modern world. So this is some scientific revelations about sexuality that in our tradition, we need to work together. Just as we've got traditional medicine and we still go to the pharmacy, we still go to the hospital acknowledging scientific knowledge, so too in the area of sexuality, that yes, we've got our understandings as Africans, but there's also scientific understanding. And she gives some examples of the discoveries that that there's a diversity within sexuality, that there isn't a clear cut as we think, but there's a continuum in sexualities that is way beyond anything we can imagine. That diversity in sexuality is an act of creation. It's not an act of sin. And I think that becomes very important in the way in which we begin to integrate this knowledge from science. And I think she wants that kind of thing to say that our cultures need to evolve with information, that we need to be informed, we need to grow, we need to develop, just as we do in other parts, we need to do that in sexuality. So she brings that scientific, psychological understanding of sexuality. And then she looks at some of the myths that people have about homosexuality, and she challenges that and says, let's go back to the reality that sexual diversity is an act of creation. It's not a sin. And I think those are critical points to which to address. Yeah.
So you've built a layered cake.
Yes.
Now you're going to ice it.
Yes.
With Nokuthula and
Yes.
Nhlanhla.
Yes. She just comes at the pinnacle to make it real, because she steps in and she says, I am a self-identified lesbian woman. And to take it further, I am a Christian. To take it even further, I am a pastor. And to take it even further, I am an activist. So we have reality, so many of us, are writing from, spaces of being heterosexual. But right now, we have the actual diversity of sexuality in our material. So we're no longer just talking about people, we are creating that voice. And that becomes not only just something that we do at the end, but it becomes something that is fundamental to the processes that we're involved in. The processes of our workshop is to say, this is not talking about anyone, but it's an inclusive space where all are included, all voices are given an opportunity to express. So it becomes the culture that we want to create in this tool that we call the supplement, that it must be included. It must be inclusive. It mustn't be talking to or talking over, but listening, equalizing us in our very basics, that there should be no space where that is non-equalizing, non-inclusive. So this is where we're aiming at.